Thank you, Milton.
You're welcome.
All right, it's not too many economists who have an assistant named Milton. All right, welcome, microeconomics students. This is our continuation of our online class. I hope everybody's doing well and staying safe, and we're getting through this slowly but surely, but we're getting through it. So everybody, just I know it's getting a little tough and being home all the time, I'm sure, but just know that we're getting through it and things are going to be okay. All right, this lecture will take us through some of the chapters in the book, not necessarily ones that Quiz 6A are going to be on, but this lecture will take us through the chapters and all the way through Quiz 6A. So if you can't see some things on the board, I will try to vocalize everything that's on the board so that if you can't see it quite perfectly, all you have to do really is listen to our lecture, okay? And especially towards the end when we talk about economics of poverty and the financial markets. All right, well, interestingly enough, we're talking about externalities. I know we touched on that. And again, what is an externality? Well, it is an uncompensated, and that's very important, it's uncompensated cost or benefit imposed upon a third party by regular market activity. Now, some students have been emailing me with this virus that's going through the world. Would that constitute a huge international externality? Well, it very well might, but for our intents and purposes for this class, we're going to stick with domestic externalities. All right, so when you do something, an externality, either it's on the consumption side, meaning you're consuming something, or it has a benefit or a cost to society, or the production side, same thing. It has a benefit or it has a cost. Okay, when a company or an individual just concentrates on their own internal cost and they don't pay attention to the external cost, that's when we run into this externality. Because you take your internal cost and your external cost, add those together, and that brings us to our social cost. All right, remember when we first started, we drew our supply and demand curves? Well, that was fine and correct, but it didn't necessarily represent the social benefit or the social cost to society in general. All right, so the first one, externality that everyone thinks about is pollution, all right? So in this case, a company is producing, in their operation, is producing more pollution and not internalizing that cost. That cost is going out into society, all right? So if that's a negative production externality, and it's producing too much, so what they want to do is have the supply curve shift back to get the optimal point for society in terms of cost, okay? There's negative and there's positive. There could be a positive production externality, and that would be, taking into consideration what we're going through, having our company doing research on a new drug for this virus. Certainly, we want them to do more than what they were just normally doing. So that would mean we'd have to have the supply curve shift to the right. Okay, and remember what we talked about. Anything that shifts to the right typically is more, shifts to the left is typically less. All right. So the negative externality, we want to produce less. A positive production externality, that's something good for society. We want them to produce more. Similarly, with consumption externalities, Example would be smoking or drinking what was behind this bar before my children cleared it all out. If we abuse tobacco or alcohol or something, that is a cost that it's hurting us, it's hurting you individually. But in a greater sense, if you're less productive, it's hurting society as well. So that's something we call a negative consumption externality. How does governments address it? Well, big tax on alcohol, big tax on cigarettes. They want us to consume less. So the demand curve to shift to the left. Positive consumption externality would, and again, it's very relevant, is we're talking about, let's say they finally, when they do get this immunity drug, having shots, polio vaccine many years ago, something like that, that would prevent children from catching or spreading different diseases. Well, that's something positive. We want you to consume, we want you to do that. So governments would encourage getting, shots for students, especially students in school. All right, again, that would shift the demand curve to the right, bringing us to our optimal point for society. Okay, and we talked about Pigou. He came up with either Pigouvian tax or a Pigouvian subsidy. If you want whoever to do less of something, you put the tax on it. If you want them to do more of something, you give them a subsidy. All right? And Costa's theorem, we'll just touch on that, basically is let's make a deal. Let's if we can, let's internalize between the two parties, let's internalize this external cost. If the transaction costs aren't too excessive and both parties are reasonable, very often we can internalize the externality. That's Costa's theorem. All right, moving on to the factors of production. Well, as we talked about earlier, factors of production: land, labor, capital, and remember in economics when we talk about capital, we are talking about hard assets. We're not talking about what you would talk about in accounting, which would be, financial capital. And we're going to get into that because you're going to need to remember this. For economics, we talk about capital. It's a hard good. It's a hammer. It's a machine center. All right? And then also there is human capital, and that's the skill set of your labor force. All right? Well, where's the best point to be? Remember we talked about in first week or second week of class, where the marginal cost equals the marginal utility. Okay, well, oddly enough, it holds true also in this labor market. We have a downward sloping product value of the marginal product for labor, because as we add more and more labor in our operation, you're just getting less bang for your buck. You're getting a diminishing return. Okay, so we have a downward sloping marginal product for labor, or I should say the value of the marginal product of labor. All right? If this was just a perfectly competitive labor market, the wage would be established. Much like when we talked about perfect competition, the price was established. Well, in this case, the price of labor is the wage. And where would we set it, or where would be the point that we want to be at? Well, it would be where your marginal cost is equal to your marginal revenue. That would be it, at the point right there. Okay, so this point, when we talk about, hey, where does the quantity of labor and the price of labor, where does it shake out? This point corresponds to our supply, market supply, and market demand. where supply and demand meet, as we talked about before, that's our equilibrium. This would be in a competitive market. This, in your book, they talk about a monopsony. Remember, monopsony is not one seller, it is one buyer. And in the case of a monopsony, a company has, let's say, is buying up all the labor. Well, if you're a monopsony, you're going to have tremendous market power. Remember, that's the ability to change the price. Well, in this case, that would be the wage. All right. Here, and what we did when we talked about monopoly, we had the point where marginal cost equals marginal revenue, and then we went up to the demand curve to find out, hey, how high can they raise the price? Because they are a monopoly. It's very similar, but it's somewhat reversed for monopsony. Here, they bring the price down to the supply curve, and they cut back on the amount, just like a monopolist will cut back on the quantity. Monopsonists will cut back on the quantity of labor, and instead of a higher price, they want a lower price. Well, in your book, they talked about, on the other side of the coin would be a labor union that would have somewhat of a monopoly on the labor. In that case, it would be somewhere, basically this is pretty much just what you really would need to know. It would lie somewhere in between what the union would be demanding and what the monopsonists would be demanding, depending on who would have more market power. Okay? Typically land, the quantity of land, as we know, is fixed. Demand can go up, but what it all boils down to, when we're trying to get, and they said this in many books, or we've said it, you're trying to get the most bang for your buck, and you've got land, labor, and capital. Well, should I use more capital? Should I use more labor? Am I using too much land? It all boils down to the marginal benefit of the labor, or the marginal benefit of the land, or the marginal benefit of the capital, divided by the price of that particular factor of production. Now, if that's higher for capital, you're getting a bigger bang for your buck than labor, then just a rule of thumb, you should add more capital, right? If, let's say, it turns out that you're getting the biggest bang for your buck out of labor, then it's just the opposite, and you would add more labor. Okay? All right. Now moving on to the economics of poverty. This is a huge subject. We could spend an awful lot of time. We could have I took an entire semester on the economics of poverty, but we're just going to hit some of the high points. In our text, they talk about the poverty line, which is important for you to remember. Other books talk about the poverty threshold. Basically, what it means, it's that line or threshold that below it or at it, you are just eking out a living. You are just making enough to basically sustain life. Just enough food, just barely enough shelter, just enough clothing, all right? It's providing you just the absolute bare minimum to sustain life. It doesn't sound very good, but so anywhere obviously below it, then you're part of the poverty. You're part of the poverty situation, and you are in the ranks of what would officially be considered poor. Okay, so below the poverty line, you would be considered poor. All right, now that would be important to remember. They also talk about actually when you break society down into 5 sections, going from the highest to the lowest segment of society. That's actually called the Gini coefficient, okay? And what the Gini coefficient does, it just tells us, hey, how is the income divided in the society? Now, that's an important factor for you to remember. It is the poverty line and the inequality of, or how equal the spread of income is. If each one of these sectors has 20% of the income, your Gini coefficient is going to be 0. That would be a perfect spread in society. Now, if the top is getting more and more, let's say one segment got 100%, then you would have a Gini coefficient of 1. So the Gini coefficient goes from 0, which means it's perfectly spread, to 1, meaning one section gets all the income. All right? So the closer you are to 1, the more unequal the disbursement of income is. All right? All right. So if you see anything that says, well, what happens, if income goes up for everybody, the poverty rate would fall. And if perhaps, let's say the income went up by 10% for the poorest, and it went up by a factor much less than 10 for everyone else, 3%, 2%. Well, the poverty rate, what would happen? The poverty rate would fall, and inequality would fall. Stands to reason, okay? So we use this Gini coefficient to measure inequality and want to see, what's happening between the segments of society, okay? So, when we're addressing poverty, we have the assistance program. Some are just plain money transfers, all right? And some are what they call in-kind. In-kind would be something like the food stamps program, all right? Now this is important because when we're talking about money transfers, and remember, a transfer payment, what we said was it is considered a gift. You are receiving something, but you're not giving any good or service in return. All right. With money transfers, the problem tends to be as the working poor start working and start receiving an income, if the dollar that they're making results in $1 less they're getting from the government, well, they're no better off. And it results in what is known as the poverty trap. So the percentage has to be low enough that gives them some incentive to work, okay? Now, with food stamps, and you want to remember this, food stamps is an in-kind way of addressing the poverty situation. It does not have the disincentives to work that actual money transfers have. And there are time limits in the food stamp program. Okay? So then we talk about, well, what are the causes for poverty? Number one cause for poverty is single parenthood. I mean, single mothers or single fathers, that is the number one. It's tough. It is very difficult. I don't know how some single parents do it. They're working 2 jobs. They're trying to take care of their kids. It is tough, and that's the number one cause of poverty. Number 2 is low education. 3 is part-time work. You're working at a job and you're only working 24 hours or so. You'd like to get full-time, but the company just doesn't want to give it to you, doesn't want to bring it on full time. That's a problem, and that's a cause of poverty. All right? Health, poor health can be a cause of poverty. Discrimination also. And as our other textbook used to say, just unfortunately, just bad luck. And what are the causes of this inequality of income? Well, number one, there's a high demand for highly skilled labor, especially in the economy now. All right, and couples that both have a very high income, if they start, a doctor will marry, for instance, a woman who's a doctor will marry a man who also happens to be a doctor. Here we have two very, very high incomes in this couple that is going to skew the numbers and change the inequality. So we have a double high earnings with couples, and there's just a larger gap between the skilled and the unskilled workforce. So there's a number of reasons for the inequality, all right? Years and years ago, when we were the Motor City, when Detroit was the Motor City, we had a lot of manufacturing jobs that you didn't need a college education for, and if you worked at it, you could earn a good, decent living, certainly a middle class living. We find that seems to be getting harder and harder. Hopefully, we'll have a lot of jobs will come back to this country, and we'll start having more manufacturing jobs in the future. All right? So those are the things on the economics of poverty. Now, the financial markets. Well, if you looked at the previous video on macro, we covered bonds and stocks at great length. We'll touch on them again right now, okay? Remember, a security is a tradable contract which gives the owner certain rights. Now, a bond is a security, okay? It's an IOU. So, and it's been called other things in other textbooks. Our authors call it, it's a financial contract, which is absolutely true. It is a financial contract. And what does it say? Well, it's a financial contract that says some party is going to pay another party, you, if you bought the bond, a certain amount of money, which is the principal, and it's going to pay you back not only the principal, but it's also going to pay you back a certain interest rate on the bond, okay? And one basic idea of bonds is the value of your bond and the prevailing interest rates are inversely related. Not what the bond is paying. If the bond is paying you 3%, all right, that's set. But if the prevailing interest rates in the economy starts going up, the value of your bond is going to go down. So there's an inverse relationship between interest rates in general and your bond value. All right? Okay. Now stocks, well, stocks, they're what? Their actual ownership in the company. All right? So that's one way for a company to raise capital would be, again, now we're not talking physical capital. It's to raise funds is they either have a bond issue or they sell stock, okay? If they don't take the money out of earnings, which a lot of companies will do that first, and you need to remember that. They will take out and reinvest their profits, but we'll be there in a minute. Okay, so stock, actual ownership in a company, and if you own stock, you know, it would be registered on the New York Stock Exchange, okay? The financial market, pretty basic. We've got the lenders who are the sellers of a good, and that good is money, and the price is the interest rate. It goes into the financial intermediaries, banks, etc., and they in turn will lend it out to the borrowers, okay? And the borrowers are the buyers of money, okay? All right, so a bond, it's a financial instrument, and it's going to give you a rate of return, okay? When a company uses financial capital, what does it use financial capital for? All right, typically, again, what we talked about. Hard assets, physical capital, hard physical assets. That's what they use the financing for. So I want you all to remember that. Now, again, there's many ways of doing it. You can borrow, they can borrow from their banks, draw down on their lines of credit. They can have a bond issue, float a bond issue. Typically that happens when they're going to be looking for a very, very, very large amount of money, okay? They can sell stock, and one thing about stock, they don't have to pay that back, all right? But it does dilute their percentage of ownership of the company. And the number one would be probably to reinvest profits, right? They reinvest profits that they made, plow them, as they say, plow it back into the company. All right? Okay. The financial intermediaries, typically we have investment banks, which are the banks that these large corporations would work with in issuing bonds. And then they have the commercial banks, which are the kind that you and I are pretty familiar with. You know, you go in and you open a checking account, you open a savings account. But in the good old days, when you did that, you used to get a toaster. Now you don't get a toaster anymore. But if you open a checking and a savings account, typically what happens, well, and my children are not really too familiar with checkbooks, but when you open a checking account, you're not going to be getting interest. You're not going to be getting interest on the checking account, but you will get what they would call a debit card, okay? And so you would use your debit card in lieu of writing checks all the time. So that on a savings account, you would receive interest, and that's pretty much what we want to remember for this chapter. Okay, so our next lecture will take us through chapters after this, and we will cover a couple more chapters, and I hope our next lecture will be coming out in just a few days. Okay? All right. Well, good luck with your reading. Good luck with quiz 6A. Everybody stay safe out there, and we'll see you soon.